Module 22, the child athlete. Let's first cover some terminology that is important to understand in the grand scheme of things here when we're looking at some of the issues associated with the child athlete. The first of which is growth. Growth is simply defined as the attainment of overall size, whereas maturation is the tempo and timing of reaching a mature biological state. So this is the progress made towards attaining size or growth. What are some important components of skeletal growth that we should be familiar with? Well, the first of which is bone length. And bone length really implies that the person is going to achieve a certain height. So that's related to the height. And here on the y-axis in this graph, we see that height is expressed in centimeters per year. And on the x-axis, we have age in years. And so we have two lines plotted on this graph. You have one for girls here. The dashed line represents the girls, and the boys are represented by the solid line. And what we're seeing here is height attainment through infancy, childhood, and through the pubertal growth spurt. And so what we notice is that once we hit the adolescent years here, at about 10 years of age or so, we get this tremendous increase in bone length. So height has been achieved at a much higher rate here than at other points throughout the life stages. The other issue here that we want to be familiar with is bone mineral density, or BMD. Now, these two panels for graphs here have two things plotted. One is growth velocity, so that is the rate at which growth is achieved. That's centimeters per month. And also on the other y-axis, we have bone mass accrual, or basically bone mineral density in grams per month. So as far as reading this graph, you got two lines here. The unshaded circles here, those are those black circles, are the circles representing the leg bone mass, as well as the spine bone mass here. And the white circles here, those represent leg length and sitting height, respectively. So what we see in this graph, the take-home message, really is that bone mineral density lags a little bit behind the actual overall length or height of the bone that's achieved. So that's important because if we interfere with either of these processes, so if we interfere with sitting height, that sitting height may not be optimized because of whatever training program we have the child on, that can be affected, as well as the bone mineral density accrual, that can be affected, as well as we saw in things like the female athlete triad. So this is an important concept to understand, that bone mineral density lags a little bit behind the actual bone length achievement during the developmental years here. So, and developmental years on this graph, I didn't mention, was anywhere from 6 to 18 years of age on the x-axis here. So why is maturation an issue in adolescence? Well, one of the important things to consider here is it could affect performance. So somebody could achieve a certain chronological age, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are as mature as other peers in that particular sport. So there is a difference between chronological age versus maturation stage, and that's something that we need to be aware of. So some techniques that we use to differentiate particularly maturation stages from chronological stages are going to be things like skeletal maturation. So we can look at the shape of bone, the width of bone, the epiphysis, particularly the epiphyseal plates, the gap among the bones. We can also look at somatic maturation, so the sexual characteristics, the secondary sexual characteristics, which include breast development in the age of menarche, genital development, pubic hair, axillary hair, facial hair, voice changes. The Tanner developmental stages, which is something a physician would use to determine maturation age. That's something that is used to determine maturation stage. We can also look at dentition and look at dental maturation as well. What are the concerns regarding exercise in adolescence? Well, we know that regular physical activity in a well-nourished child is going to be associated with skeletal muscle and growth. That's going to be normal. There will be an improvement in cardiovascular fitness, neuromuscular coordination improves, and even cognitive function can improve. However, the downside here is that we know that intense training combined with poor nutrition spells disaster, primarily with skeletal growth, which can be delayed and also permanently impaired. That's the fear here. So the adult stature might actually be affected, and that may then inevitably lead to some challenges in how they perceive themselves. Menstrual dysfunction, we saw that with the female athlete triad. Osteopenia and osteoporosis are a very real threat with this kind of combination of intense training and poor nutrition. So these are some concerns that we have. How can an impairment in skeletal growth be detected? Well, we can look at skeletal growth. We can also look at the prepubertal growth. If it's slowed or close to zero, that means that we're not seeing any further development and attainment of overall size that would normally occur. That is a sign. If there's reduced or no peak height velocity, so again, the rate at which bone is lengthening, how is that affected is important here. We, of course, can look at maturation stage, the chronological age. If that's greater than bone age by more than 2 years, then that means there's been a slowing of the maturation process. If there's no menarche in females before the age of 16, then this again is an indication that perhaps skeletal growth is impaired. What are the theories regarding exercise and growth deficiencies? Well, we know that intense training is going to incur some stress injuries, or at least increase the risk for it. The epiphyseal plates are the most susceptible. Of course, there's little leaguer elbow from kids who are participating in overhead throwing sports like baseball, softball, and they're overused in that regard. There's Osgood-Schlatter disease, which is a development of a painful lump below the kneecap. Sports that predispose a child to this are running and jumping and any kind of swift change in direction. Then there's the iliac crest apophysitis, which basically is an inflamed growth plate, and it's very, very painful. So these are all associated with too much stress from exercise and participating in a particular sport. We know that low-calorie diets can lead to nutritional inadequacies. Perhaps there's going to be short stature as a result of this, but that could be just selection bias in a lot of these research studies, so that still needs to be teased out a little bit more. There could be familial delayed growth as a result of this. Perhaps there's just something genetically pre-programmed for a delay in the maturation process. Some athletes won't be affected by this at all, despite participating intensely in sports and perhaps not getting all the nutrition that they're supposed to. There, of course, are environmental concerns, psychological issues, emotional issues, social issues, parental issues, and coach involvement in this whole process. Can catch-up growth occur? Well, in some studies, we know that if we reduce the training or cease training, there could be incomplete or a complete return to normal development. So it's a bit of a risk that people take by participating in sports, and if they're really intensely training and not getting proper nutrition, they run the risk of not attaining growth and, of course, maturation towards growth. So it's really dependent upon the severity of the maturation delay. What are the energy and protein requirements? Well, as far as macronutrients are concerned, for energy, I would refer you to the DRI tables that give a nice estimate for the different years and how much in terms of kilocalories children are supposed to be getting. For carbohydrate, we need more data in order to substantiate how much carbohydrate we should be recommending, particularly for the child athlete. As far as fat, children aged 5 to 14 years of age, less than 35% of total kilocalories should coming from fat, with no more than 10% coming from saturated fat, simply because of the concern for cardiovascular disease. As far as adolescents are concerned, less than 30% of total kcals should be coming from fat for the adolescent population. However, we still need more research in these areas. As far as protein is concerned, I would refer you to the DRI tables once again. For micronutrient requirements, vitamins we know are really only a concern when the diet is energy restricted. Other than that, adolescents in particular tend to consume quite a number of calories, so the likelihood of them getting all of their nutrients, particularly micronutrients, increases. Of course, there's always going to be a concern, particularly with the minerals here. Calcium, iron, and zinc can be problematic, but again, the energy restricted diets are the ones that we really want to pay attention to. How does the risk for hypothermia during exercise in children compare with adults? Well, we know in children that there's going to be a decrease in skin temperatures, and this is basically due to greater vasoconstriction. So there's far less blood flow going to the skin in children compared with adults. There's also going to be a greater amount of heat that's lost, and simply because there's a greater skin surface area to muscle mass ratio. There's far smaller muscle mass in children, but the skin surface area is a little bit greater, and so that combination actually predisposes the child to greater amounts of heat loss. The upside here is that there's a little bit of an increase in BMR, so that could be advantageous for heat production and keeping them right at core body temperature. So the bottom line here is that in children, if the adult is feeling cold, then children are going to feel colder, and they're a little bit, as far as the risk for hypothermia is concerned, there's a greater risk for hypothermia simply because the rate of heat loss can be greater in the child compared with the adult. How does the risk for hyperthermia during exercise in children compare with adults? Well, in the heat, we know that we're going to get an increase in heat production, and this is again due to decreased heat transfer from muscle to skin. That's because of the increased surface area to mass ratio between the skin and muscle mass. So environmentally, if those temperatures are higher, there's going to be more absorption of the environmental heat and not in the other direction. There's also a decreased sweating rate, so overall and actually per sweat gland, which is going to be about 2.5 times lower. As a comparison, as far as sweat is concerned, about 400 to 500 milliliters per meter squared of skin surface area per hour versus the adult, which is about 700 to 800 milliliters per meter squared per hour. So there's an increased sweating threshold for children as well that we need to be aware of. So if the adult is feeling hot, the child is feeling even hotter. So there's a much higher risk for hyperthermia in the child athlete compared with the adult. So we really need to be proactive about monitoring children when they're participating in hot weather, particularly in sports. Well, children are going to rely much more on convection. So that is basically any air movement around the child to dissipate the heat. They're also going to use more radiative heat, so they're trying to just radiate the heat instead of evaporating sweat to cool the body. In the adult, sweating is really, and evaporation of sweat is the main mechanism by which we can keep the body cool. In the child, they're going to rely more on convective currents and radiation to do so. So this is going to be achieved through greater vasodilation. So the child actually has more vasodilation, which then allows for radiant heat to be expelled. They also have a longer acclimatization time. So if you're moving to an area where you're going to be participating in a sport and it's hotter there, it's going to take them far longer than the adult. The average adult time is about 14 days or so to acclimatize to environmental temperatures. In the child, that's going to be far longer. They also are going to have a decreased cardiac output, which means performance can be reduced as a result. So how do I prevent hypohydration? Well, I would refer you to Module 12 there and the use of fluids and sports beverages, etc., in order to help the child athlete prevent any hypohydration. What are other considerations? Well, we want to look at food habits. We want to see what their perception of their own body image is going to be. We want to see what the sources of nutrition information for them are so that we can make a better assessment of whether or not they are nutritionally sound and able to participate in the sport effectively and not affect their performance accordingly. So the practical application here, we never want to make any assumptions across the board, particularly with children. So we want to ensure nutritional adequacy, establish sound nutritional habits during childhood so that they are just accustomed to that's the way things are done. We want to perform an annual growth assessment, and that could mean looking at anthropometrics, so physical body measurements, looking at the pubertal stages, the Tanner stages of development, looking at bone age versus the chronological age, and determining maturational status. We want to look at nutritional status, taking a look at the diet history and food records. And of course, we want to monitor any symptoms of any eating disorders or disordered eating patterns. And body image assessment. These are all very, very important. And if need be, we of course want to counsel our athletes and above all educate the athletes as well as the coaches and parents.